What if I told you that two of the most important medical discoveries of the last 100 years weren't made in a laboratory? That the drugs responsible for saving hundreds of millions of lives, drugs that sit in hospital formularies, that are recommended by the World Health Organization, that have won not one but two Nobel Prizes in medicine, were discovered by scientists who did something almost no one in modern research was willing to do. They went back to ancient texts, back to remedies that ordinary people had been using for thousands of years, long before anyone understood why they worked. Most people have no idea that roughly a quarter of all pharmaceutical drugs currently in use are derived directly from plants that traditional healers identified centuries or millennia ago. Not inspired by, derived from. The active compounds inside them, isolated, refined, and turned into the pills your doctor prescribes, came from the same roots, barks, and leaves that ancient physicians crushed, brewed, and pressed into wounds without a single clinical trial to guide them. Today, I'm going to show you 10 ancient healing secrets that modern science has since validated, in some cases with the highest honors medicine can bestow. These aren't folk tales. They aren't alternative medicine. They are the foundation that modern pharmacology was quietly built on, and most people have no idea. If you want ancient wisdom about healthy life and longevity, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Remedy 1. Willow bark, the origin of aspirin. More than 3,500 years ago, an Egyptian physician pressed the bark of a willow tree against a patient's wound and recorded what happened. The pain eased. The swelling came down. He wrote it in a papyrus, and it stayed in the record. Around the same time, Sumerian clay tablets from Mesopotamia were documenting the same remedy. Willow bark for pain. Willow bark for fever. Willow bark for the kind of full-body inflammation that made ordinary work impossible. By the time Hippocrates arrived in the 5th century BC, it had already been working for over 1,000 years. He prescribed an infusion of willow bark to women in labor to dull the pain of childbirth. Pliny the Elder documented it in Rome. Greek soldiers used it. Chinese physicians used it. On opposite sides of the known world, separated by thousands of miles and languages that shared no words, people had arrived at the same plant for the same reason. It worked. What none of them knew, what they didn't need to know, was why. Inside the bark of the willow tree is a compound called salicin. In the body, salicin converts to salicylic acid, which blocks the production of prostaglandins, the signaling molecules that trigger pain and inflammation throughout the body. It took until the mid-1800s for European chemists to isolate it, and until 1897 for a Bayer chemist named Felix Hoffmann to synthesize a more stable, less stomach-irritating version, acetylsalicylic acid. He called it aspirin. Today, aspirin is the most widely used drug on the planet. An estimated 40,000 metric tons are consumed every year. It prevents heart attacks. It reduces stroke risk. It lowers fever. It is being actively studied as a potential cancer preventive. And every milligram of it traces its lineage directly to a piece of bark that a Sumerian physician picked up from a riverbank 3.5 millennia ago and pressed against someone who was hurting. The ancient world didn't invent aspirin. They just found it first. It took us 3,000 years to catch up. Remedy 2. Sweet Wormwood, the Nobel Prize. In 1969, Chinese scientist Tu Youyou was handed an impossible assignment. Malaria was killing soldiers in Vietnam faster than combat was. Western researchers had already tested more than 240,000 chemical compounds for anti-malarial activity. None of them worked well enough. Mao Zedong personally ordered the project. Find something. Find it fast. Tu did something that none of the Western researchers had thought to do. She went to the library. Not a modern one. She read ancient Chinese medical texts, manuscripts dating back centuries, some over 1,000 years old, looking for any reference to plants used against the kind of recurring fevers that were the signature symptom of malaria. She and her team worked through more than 2,000 traditional herbal recipes. They identified 640 with potential. They tested 380 extracts in the lab. One kept appearing. A plant called King Hao, sweet wormwood. Artemisia annua. It had been referenced in Chinese medical texts as far back as 340 AD, when a physician named Ge Hong described using it for intermittent fevers. But when Tu's team tested extracts of it in the standard way, boiling the plant material in water, the results were inconsistent and weak. So she went back to the original text. And there, in Ge Hong's 1,400-year-old instructions, was the detail that changed everything. He didn't boil it. He wrote, "Take a handful of King Hao, soak in water, wring out the juice, and drink it all. No heat. Rule temperature." Tu switched to a low-temperature ether extraction. The active compound, artemisinin, survived intact. It eliminated malaria parasites with 100% efficacy in animal models. Tu then volunteered herself as the first human test subject before treating 21 patients. Every single one recovered. The World Health Organization now recommends artemisinin-based combination therapy as the frontline treatment for malaria worldwide. Roughly 400 million doses are administered every year. In the Nobel Committee's own words, when artemisinin is used in combination therapy, it reduces malaria mortality by more than 20% overall and by more than 30% in children. In 2015, Tu Yo won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. In her acceptance lecture, she called artemisinin a gift from traditional Chinese medicine to the world. She wasn't being modest. She was being precise. Remedy 3. Honey, the world's oldest antibiotic. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, dating back 3,000 years, describe packing wounds with honey to prevent infection and accelerate healing. Not as folklore. As clinical instruction, written by physicians who observed outcomes and recorded what worked. Ancient Greek physicians used it. Roman soldiers carried it into battle as wound dressing. Ayurvedic medicine documented it as a treatment for eye infections, digestive disorders, and respiratory illness for at least 4,000 years. For most of the 20th century, medicine filed honey under quaint folk remedy and moved on to antibiotics. Then the antibiotic resistance crisis arrived. And researchers, running out of options against bacteria that had learned to defeat pharmaceutical drugs, started looking at what had worked before the drugs existed. What they found was that honey's antimicrobial activity isn't simple. It isn't just the sugar concentration creating an osmotic environment that bacteria can't survive in, though that is part of it. Raw honey produces hydrogen peroxide through enzymatic activity, a direct antibacterial mechanism. It contains defensive 1, an antimicrobial peptide secreted by bees that attacks bacterial cell walls. Its pH is low enough to inhibit most pathogens on its own. And, critically, honey attacks bacteria through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. which means bacteria struggle to develop resistance to it, the way they develop resistance to a single antibiotic compound targeting a single pathway. Medical-grade honey, specifically Manuka honey from New Zealand, is now FDA cleared for use in wound care. It is used in hospitals for chronic wounds, burn treatment, and post-surgical infections that have failed to respond to conventional antibiotics. A 2009 clinical study published in the Journal of Advanced Nursing found that standardized antibacterial honey outperformed silver sulfadiazine dressing in burn patients, healing faster, with lower infection rates. A comprehensive 2,225 review in Health Science Reports confirmed honey's documented effectiveness across wound types, attributing it to that same multi-mechanism antimicrobial action. The ancient Egyptian physician who packed a wound with honey 3,000 years ago didn't know about defensin 1 or hydrogen peroxide release or biofilm disruption. He knew that wounds treated with honey healed cleanly, and wounds that weren't often didn't. He wrote it down. 3,000 years later, hospitals are still using it. That is not coincidence. That is a clinical track record that most modern drugs would envy. Remedy 4. Garlic broad-spectrum medicine in a clove. The ancient Egyptians gave garlic to the workers who built the pyramids, not as a flavor additive, as medicine, as a daily ration intended to keep thousands of laborers healthy in conditions that would otherwise devastate an unprotected immune system. 18 Egyptian medical papyri list garlic in documented therapeutic preparations. Hippocrates prescribed it for pulmonary complaints, infections, and digestive disorders. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic texts describe it as one of the most protective foods in the entire pharmacopoeia. Chinese medical traditions have used it therapeutically for over 3,000 years. Louis Pasteur, the man who established germ theory itself, was among the first modern scientists to formally demonstrate the antibacterial activity of raw garlic extract in 1858. He was confirming something that every ancient medical tradition on Earth had already been practicing for millennia. The mechanism lives in a single moment. When you crush a garlic clove, an enzyme called alliinase is released from ruptured cells. It immediately converts a compound called alliin into allicin, a sulfur-containing molecule that is among the most potent broad-spectrum antimicrobials found in any plant on Earth. Allicin disrupts RNA synthesis in bacteria, interferes with lipid production in fungal cell walls, and inhibits the enzymes that pathogens need to replicate. It is active against bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites simultaneously. A 2024 comprehensive review published in Frontiers in Immunology documented garlic's confirmed activity against antibiotic-resistant strains, including MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, the superbug that has become one of the most dangerous pathogens in modern hospitals. As the global antibiotic resistance crisis deepens, researchers are now seriously investigating garlic-derived compounds as adjunct therapies precisely because their multi-compound attack mechanism makes resistance development significantly harder. One critical detail the ancient world got right without knowing the chemistry: heat destroys allicin almost immediately. Raw garlic, or garlic crushed and added at the end of cooking, is a fundamentally different medicine than garlic cooked from the start. The Egyptian laborers who ate raw garlic every morning understood the delivery method perfectly. They just didn't have the biochemistry to explain it. Remedy 5. Turmeric, the anti-inflammatory the ancient world got right. Turmeric has been used in Ayurvedic medicine for at least 4,000 years. It appears in ancient Indian surgical texts as a wound healer. It is documented in traditional Chinese medicine as a treatment for pain and inflammatory conditions. Ancient Egyptian physicians used it. It has been a foundational therapeutic substance across more civilizations for a longer continuous period than almost any other plant remedy in recorded history. For centuries, Western medicine largely dismissed it as a cooking spice with cultural significance but limited clinical relevance. Then researchers started looking at the active compound, curcumin, and the dismissal collapsed quickly. Curcumin has now been the subject of more than 3,000 published clinical studies, making it one of the most researched natural compounds in all of pharmacology. The primary mechanism that has attracted the most attention is its inhibition of NF-κB, nuclear factor kappa B, a molecular signaling switch that functions as one of the master regulators of the body's inflammatory response. When NF-κB is chronically activated, it drives the sustained low-grade inflammation that researchers now call inflammaging, the baseline inflammatory state that underlies cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, and most cancers. Curcumin switches it off. Studies have shown curcumin to be as effective as ibuprofen for managing osteoarthritis pain, without the gastric irritation or kidney strain associated with long-term acid use. It shows documented activity against several cancer cell lines in vitro. Clinical trials are actively investigating it in the contexts of colorectal cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, and inflammatory bowel disease, conditions that share chronic NF-κB activation as a root driver. The ancient Ayurvedic physician who pressed turmeric paste into a wound 4,000 years ago didn't know what NF-κB was. But he understood, through generations of careful clinical observation, that turmeric reduced swelling, accelerated healing, and protected against infection in ways that other available remedies didn't. He built it into the foundations of an entire medical system. And the 3,000 studies that followed him have spent 4,000 years confirming that he was right. Remedy 6. Acupuncture, the needles that convinced modern medicine. Acupuncture is 4,000 years old. It emerged from ancient Chinese medical theory around the concept of qi, vital energy flowing through the body along specific pathways called meridians. The theory is one that most modern scientists are not prepared to accept. The outcomes, however, have become increasingly difficult to dismiss. The World Health Organization's Traditional Medicine Advisory Group, a body that does not endorse treatments lightly, has reviewed more than 20 clinical trials confirming that acupuncture is effective for improving pain and reducing functional impairment in chronic non-specific lower back pain. It has documented effectiveness for osteoarthritis, headache and migraine prevention, and chemotherapy-induced nausea. In some clinical settings in China, acupuncture is used as anesthesia during open-heart surgery, not as a philosophical statement, but because it works well enough in certain contexts to replace pharmaceutical sedation. Modern neuroimaging research has begun to explain the mechanism in terms that don't require the concept of qi at all. Acupuncture needle insertion at specific points triggers measurable changes in the central nervous system, activating endorphin release, modulating the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex, and stimulating connective tissue in ways that alter local and systemic pain signaling. Studies using fMRI show that acupuncture treatment changes brain activity in the same regions that respond to opioid analgesics. Some studies have found that sham acupuncture, where needles are inserted at non-traditional points, also produces measurable effects, which has complicated interpretation. But whether the precise point locations matter, or whether it is the needling itself that drives the response, the outcome data is real. Real pain reduction. Real functional improvement. Measured by the same instruments used to evaluate pharmaceutical interventions. The ancient Chinese physician who developed this system 4,000 years ago was working with a theoretical framework that modern science has largely rejected. But the clinical observations embedded in that framework, that specific physical interventions at specific locations produce reproducible therapeutic effects, have survived every attempt to disprove them. Remedy 7. Ginger, the nausea medicine that outperformed the pharmaceutical. Ancient Chinese medical texts dating back to the 4th century BC describe ginger as a treatment for nausea, digestive distress, and inflammatory pain. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic tradition classifies it as one of the most therapeutically versatile plants in the entire pharmacopoeia, used for everything from respiratory infection to joint pain to morning sickness. Greek physicians used it. Roman physicians used it. Medieval Arab physicians used it. Sailors crossing the Indian Ocean packed it specifically to manage seasickness during voyages that could last months. There is almost no traditional medical system anywhere on Earth that doesn't have a documented history with ginger. And the reason for that cross-cultural convergence is becoming increasingly clear in the clinical literature. The active compounds, gingerols and shogalls, work through a mechanism that is elegantly direct. They bind to serotonin receptors in the gut and in the brainstem, specifically the 5-HT3 receptors that regulate nausea signaling. This is precisely the same receptor targeted by one of the most widely prescribed pharmaceutical anti-nausea drugs, ondansetron. Ginger just gets there naturally and without the side effect profile. A randomized clinical trial published in the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology found that ginger was as effective as vitamin B6 in reducing nausea and vomiting in early pregnancy. And vitamin B6 is the standard first-line pharmaceutical recommendation. Multiple clinical reviews have confirmed its efficacy for chemotherapy-induced nausea, post-operative nausea, and motion sickness. The FDA has classified gingerols as generally recognized as safe, a designation that reflects not just safety, but an established evidence base. The sailors who packed ginger for long ocean voyages didn't understand serotonin receptor pharmacology. They understood that people who ate it before getting on the boat were less sick at sea than people who didn't. They packed it for the same reason every ancient medical tradition documented it, because it reliably worked. And it still does, on the same biological mechanisms for the same reasons that it worked 3,000 years ago. Remedy 8. Aloe Vera, the plant that ancient physicians called Immortal. The ancient Egyptians called it the plant of immortality. They buried it with pharaohs. They used it in embalming preparations. And more practically, they used it as a topical treatment for burns, wounds, and skin infections, a use documented in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in human history. Dating to around 1050 BC, ancient Greek physicians used it. Alexander the Great is said to have secured an island off the coast of East Africa specifically to maintain a supply of aloe for treating his soldiers' wounds. Chinese physicians have documented its use for over 2,000 years. Modern dermatology has largely confirmed what the Egyptian physicians recorded in their papyri. The gel inside an aloe vera leaf contains a complex mixture of compounds: acamanin, a polysaccharide with documented immunomodulatory effects, and anthraquinones with antimicrobial activity. and several compounds that accelerate fibroblast proliferation, the cellular process that drives wound closure and tissue regeneration. Clinical studies have shown that aloe gel applied to first and second-degree burns reduces healing time significantly compared to conventional dressings, reduces pain, and lowers infection rates. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials found that aloe vera treatment reduced burn wound healing time by roughly 9 days compared to control groups, a difference that is clinically meaningful, not marginal. The mechanism is partly antimicrobial, partly anti-inflammatory, and partly a direct stimulation of the skin's own repair machinery. Acumanon specifically activates macrophages, the immune cells that clean up damaged tissue and coordinate the repair response, in ways that accelerate the transition from the inflammatory phase of wound healing to the proliferative phase. Alexander the Great understood none of that. He understood that soldiers whose wounds were treated with aloe recovered faster and lost fewer limbs to infection than soldiers whose wounds weren't. He secured the supply line. And the clinical evidence that followed him by 2,500 years confirmed he was making the right decision. Remedy 9. Fermented foods. The gut medicine. Every major ancient civilization on Earth independently developed fermented foods. Ancient Koreans fermented cabbage into kimchi. Ancient Europeans fermented cabbage into sauerkraut. Ancient Middle Eastern cultures fermented milk into kefir and yogurt. Ancient Chinese cultures fermented soybeans into miso and tempeh. The Romans consumed fermented fish sauce, garum, as a staple condiment. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine prescribed fermented dairies specifically for digestive disorders and immune support. These were not the same cultures. They were not in communication. They were separated by entire oceans, speaking different languages, living in entirely different climates. And they all, independently, arrived at the same conclusion, that food transformed by controlled microbial activity had properties that fresh food did not, that it kept people healthier, that it supported digestion in ways nothing else quite did, that people who ate it regularly were, observably, different from people who didn't. What they were all doing, without the vocabulary of microbiology to describe it, was cultivating the gut microbiome, delivering billions of live lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains directly to the gastrointestinal tract, the same strains that researchers now know regulate immune function, produce short-chain fatty acids that protect the gut lining, synthesize neurotransmitters including serotonin, and maintain the intestinal barrier that prevents systemic inflammation from chronic leaky gut. The modern science of the gut microbiome is one of the most rapidly advancing fields in all of medicine. Researchers are finding connections between gut microbial diversity and conditions ranging from cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes to depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. A 2021 study published in Cell found that a high-fermented food diet significantly increased microbiome diversity and reduced inflammatory markers in as little as 10 weeks, more effectively than a high-fiber diet alone. The ancient Korean grandmother who made kimchi every autumn, the Caucasian herder who fermented milk into kefir, the Roman legionnaire who put garum on everything, none of them knew what a microbiome was. They just knew, through centuries of accumulated observation, that these foods made people better. The science has spent decades building the vocabulary to explain what they already knew. Remedy 10. Fasting. The therapy that won a Nobel Prize. Hippocrates said it in the 5th century BC, and he said it plainly, "Instead of using medicine, fast for a day." He wasn't prescribing starvation. He was describing something he had observed repeatedly and across many patients in his clinical practice. The body, given a period without food, did something that food could not. It healed in a different way. It cleared what accumulation had built. It reset what chronic use had worn down. This wasn't unique to Greek medicine. The ancient Egyptians fasted as a practice of purification they understood to be physically as well as spiritually restorative. Pythagoras reportedly fasted for 40 days at a stretch, claiming it sharpened perception and elevated cognition. A claim that modern neuroscience has since linked to measurable changes in ketone metabolism and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The Stoic philosopher Seneca fasted regularly and prescribed it to friends, writing that the body became calm and still in a way no other practice produced. Every blue zone population ever studied, the groups of people who consistently live past 100 in exceptional health, incorporates deliberate periods of reduced or absent food intake as part of their cultural practice. The Okinawan Hara-Hachi-Bu, the Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath meal patterns, the traditional Mediterranean two-meal day, what none of them could explain was the mechanism. That had to wait until 2016, when Japanese cell biologist Yoshinori Ohsumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for mapping exactly what the body does when it isn't digesting food. The answer is autophagy, from the Greek for self-eating. When the body is deprived of incoming nutrients, cells activate a recycling program, dismantling their own damaged proteins, dysfunctional organelles, and the accumulated cellular debris that builds up with age and stress. Misfolded proteins that would otherwise accumulate and cause cellular dysfunction get broken down and repurposed. Mitochondria that have lost efficiency get cleared and replaced. The same amyloid beta proteins that form the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease are among the structures that autophagic activity targets and removes. Modern research has linked regular fasting to reduced inflammatory markers, improved insulin sensitivity, measurably lower biological age in epigenetic studies, and dramatically reduced rates of the chronic diseases that dominate modern mortality: cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and neurodegeneration. Hippocrates had no concept of autophagy. He had no epigenetic clocks. He had no Nobel Committee to validate his prescription. He had 2,000 years of accumulated observation from a medical tradition that paid careful attention to what the human body actually did. And what it did when given a day without food was exactly what Yoshinori Ohsumi spent his career proving. 2,500 years of clinical practice. 1 Nobel Prize in medicine. The same conclusion. 10 remedies. Thousands of years of accumulated observation from civilizations that had no universities, no clinical trials, no randomized controlled studies, and no pharmaceutical industry to tell them what was real and what wasn't. They had something different. They had careful attention. They had continuous feedback from their own patients about what worked and what didn't. And they had the discipline to write it down and pass it forward. Modern pharmacology didn't replace ancient healing. In the most important cases, it translated it. And the question that keeps coming back after every one of these stories is the same one. If they got all of this right, with none of our tools, none of our instruments, none of our institutions, what else did they get right that we haven't confirmed yet? Drop a comment and tell me which remedy surprised you the most. I read every single one. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more related topics, and we are just getting started.